What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, due to her being intellectually disabled. At 23 years of age, her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time the procedure had only been done about 100 times in US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation. They say that the neurosurgeons, or whatever they're called, ask the patient to count from 10 to know when they should stop cutting down. I've heard that they stopped when her speech was incoherent. Saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years. All that because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. I noticed this is more disturbing than terrifying, but I think it fits. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. This is a rabbit hole of a case, only partially classified by the CIA, until information was released 3 years after initial capture. Robert Levinson, former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the US government was adamant that he was not acting with a government party, only private PI work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as part of the CIA on an unauthorized mission to gather data on an Iranian regime. He has had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson has 7 kids, one of which with his mom, that have traveled to Iran find their dad and husband, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest held American captive at 12 years. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy, but there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air Conducted many tests, for example blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. One that is not US. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they described it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the MAU uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving MAU to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about until recently. Not really terrifying but f'd up, Operation Paperclip, where after World War II the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells, the most noteworthy being Werner von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. The MK Ultra mind control experiments. The CIA basically tested various means of mind/suggestibility control through many front organizations. The main intent was to improve interrogation methods, but later expanded into other avenues of research such as making sleeper agents. Tests were performed both with and without knowledge or permission on large numbers or American and Canadian citizens. While some files have been declassified or leaked, the bulk of the files have either been destroyed or remain classified. As a result, larger statistics on the project such as death tolls, numbers of subjects and personnel involved, and research gained, can only be estimated as of today. The documents from United States v. Reynolds. The short version is that a B-29 crashed, and there was an official report about the cause. Families of people who died in the crash wanted the report, which may have included evidence of negligence that led to the deaths. Because the report was embarrassing, the US government refused to hand it over and claimed, falsely, that the report contained sensitive information about military secrets. They asserted what is now known as a state secrets privilege to keep facts from the affected families and from the public at large. Courts, up to the Supreme Court, accepted this argument and established the principle by precedent. Decades later, the report was declassified, and there were no secrets in. The entire thing was just a lie all along, and the courts went along with it, and the practical result is that the government can just lie at any time about national security whenever they want to cover up evil or idiotic actions by government officials, and they always get away with it. That's why, for example, people tortured by the CIA can't sue, because our torture program is a state secret. Unit 731 in Japan pre-World War II. Chemical testing, infection of sexually transmitted disease by rape, frostbite, isolation, and vivisection on all walks of human life. Not much declassified, but some survivors accurately depicted the story. The CIA made a deal with the Russians, like Operation Paperclip, to let the Japanese scientists evade justice and share their findings with the US government. However, the Russians were particularly disturbed by Unit 731 and decided to execute a lot of Japanese scientists on Russian soil. An SRI contractor using remote viewing saw an approximation of what had happened to the US forces who were sent by Carter to save the Iranian embassy hostages. They described a desert, with apes running away from fires in the distance. The contractor logged the report, went home, returned the next day to Carter announcing the failure of the operation. Also the hoaxer Uri Geller may be possibly being an Israeli intelligence officer, who was insanely close to Netanyahu through his rise. The sources from Annie Jacobson's Phenomena. Really interesting book on the US/Cold War, a search into park and remote viewing. In 1953, the US Army sprayed the Canadian city of Winnipeg with zinc cadmium sulfide in order to test its efficacy as a chemical weapon. At the time, Winnipeg had a population of 300,000. The people of Winnipeg noticed the cloudy fog being sprayed from the planes and were told that the fog was a test of a defensive shield to protect them in times of war. As if that wasn't bad enough, in 1964, they then repeated the experiment on 2 more Canadian cities. The original plan for the spraying of Suffield, Manitoba was for the city to be sprayed down with 100 pounds of VX, but that portion of the plan was later scrapped before it could come to fruition. For context, VX is currently considered a chemical weapon of mass destruction that is banned worldwide, and it is illegal for a medical facility to have more than 22 pounds of the stuff, or for a military facility to have more than 100 grams of the stuff. This is because inhaling mere milligrams of the stuff is fatal to humans. People die because all of their muscles are paralyzed, causing them to slowly asphyxiate to death.